Hey, everybody, we're joined by the governor of the great state of Minnesota, Tim Walz. Governor Walz, good to have you back on News and Views.
Great to be back up here. Beautiful days that we're going through. Bragging about my pheasants to you.
You need to get this election over so you get me down where you're finding those birds.
We're going. Worthington's packed with pheasants,
Really?
so we'll bring you down there.
So how'd you do opening day?
Got a couple roosters right out of the bat. Yeah.
We walked, and we got some birds, but not the amount of birds I'm spoiled that way.
Yeah, this reminded me of being young. I grew up there in that area around winter and everything, so reminded me of young kid again.
Yep.
Roosters were flying every 5 minutes.
But we got a halfway decent crop, so we can't whine. That's the main thing.
That's good.
Governor, middle of a big race, tough race. A lot of people saying this race is swinging back and forth. What are you seeing?
I knew it'd be close the whole time. These midterms historically do that. That's just the way it's going to go. I think when you got the economy the way it is globally, some people fall into that. I think the good news is Minnesota came out of COVID faring better than most places, got the lowest unemployment rate. We had the highest exports we've seen. Job creation is back up 12 straight months of good job growth, and I think we're stabilizing a lot of that and looking towards the future. So I think when it comes time to come home, people know we passed budgets. Balanced budgets. We created surpluses. We cut middle-class taxes. We increased local government aid and put a really good ag bill together. So I'm feeling good about the accomplishments.
Let's talk about a couple of things that they're saying. Give you a chance to address it. Number one, you're weak on crime. Are you weak on crime?
Well, that's false. I've asked to up those budgets every single time. They got fact-checked on their ad. It's not true. No one wants to see crime increase, so we're working the best we can. Local entities are the lead on that. The state's supporting them. Story came out in today's Star Tribune. Significant drop in violent crime from last year to this year in the month period. They got a police chief now in Minneapolis that's on board this week, and so no, we're not. We need to invest in that. We need to get guns off the streets. The judicial branch will make sure that we're not seeing repeat offenders, but of course not. And we're seeing crime across the country go up. Minnesota's just always had been traditionally very low. So that's what they say. But again, they offer you no plan. Just, no plan, no money. I offered up $300 million to local entities. My opponent said he had a plan, not $0. So, well, how are you going to hire police if you're not giving them any money? So it's a big difference.
Another point they make is that you don't care for outstate Minnesota. You're sitting here right now in Moorhead, Fargo.
They edited a video years ago and think that. Look, I've talked about this to you, Joel. I graduated with 24 kids in my class, 12 were cousins. My 88-year-old mom's still on our farm. I served on the Ag Committee for 12 years. We upped local government aid to rural Minnesota for the first time in over 20 years. And the Mankato Free Press said the governors under this administration has done more for greater Minnesota in terms of infrastructure, broadband, and school funding than any governor in 50 years. So this idea of dividing us, they hate the idea of one Minnesota. They hate the idea, whether you live in Bloomington or you live in Moorhead, that we're in this together. The strength of the community up in northwest Minnesota is dependent on how strong Mankato is in the south. So I still want to work together. I think, again, I had a divided legislature, and I'm going to be the first governor in Minnesota history to never issue a veto in my first term. I'm willing to compromise with them. So, telling people that it's dividing us or telling them they don't care about this or telling them they don't know about this, I lived in greater Minnesota. My opponents live in the city. So that's nothing new.
Okay. Let me hit you with one more. A lot of talk about education and where Minnesota is headed in education really kind of mirrors, I think, what's happening nationally. Yeah. And a lot of that, it doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out it's all post-COVID. Yeah. But one of the arguments that your opposition is making is the fact that you were so strict on COVID that those test scores went further down than they had to.
Yeah, do they talk about the 14,600 people who died during COVID? Do they talk about, that decisions had to be made early in March 2020? Look, we had work to do before COVID happened. It is across the country. We invested in making sure that that we were there for some of the catch-up work and all that. But the fact of the matter is, go ahead and look at the national statistics. Look at the deaths per 100,000 for every state in the upper Midwest, and we are clearly the lowest. So I made a decision that made sure we had to protect lives on the best information we had. In terms of rolling back some of the COVID restrictions, we probably fell right in the middle of the 50 states. Pretty quick to have those things come off, getting folks to recover. But again, my opponent's making the case, said there's too much money in schools. It's a black hole, and he wants to voucherize them. Well, you tell me how that's going to help. I believe in teachers. I believe in students. I've done that my whole life. I believe in parents. So I'm going to be there. These are folks that just ignored COVID. So you didn't need to do anything, Governor, because COVID was just a cold. Well, COVID was not just a cold. It killed 1 million Americans. So
is Minneapolis, St. Paul area safe?
It needs to be safer. I would agree on that. We did see today in the paper, we saw a significant drop in all of these crimes. Measured against other places, crime is up globally, and it's up nationally. That's a major metropolitan area. We've got over about 2.5 million people in a 6-county area, which is the entire population of North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming in a pretty small area. We've got to do better. We've got to get guns off the streets. We've got to make sure we're moving back upstream. These are younger criminals, making sure that we have a system in place, and Minneapolis needs to hire some more police. But just as I said in today's paper, the statistics that came out, we've seen a year-to-year drop fairly significantly, especially in those violent crimes.
So anyone that knows me knows who I'd be voting for if I lived across the river. So I'm not going to try to hide that. But when I see you, Governor, what I see isn't that congressman that became governor. What I see is that military man that was a teacher and a coach. And when you look at this next generation that everybody seems to be saying is just so far behind, and so I don't see it. And I know that at the end you had to grade it, but man, the next generation of Minnesotans looks pretty bright to me.
Look, standardized testing matters, but just keep in mind, 40% fewer of our students, a very few numbers took these tests in the first place because you could opt out of them. Almost no one takes the ACT anymore. I'm not minimizing standardized testing, but as a teacher, these kids learned resiliency. These kids learned compassion from one another. These kids learned problem solving. They had to figure out how to get online and do this. I'm working with my son, who's a 7th, 8th, and 9th grader during all this. I'm really proud of what he's been able to do, and I know this has been really challenging. So the idea of grading on this one test, again, there's a very different opinion about Minnesota. My opponent is this black, dark, bleak future. Everything's failing. Our schools are a mess. They're the worst in the country. I don't see it that way. Yes, there's problems. We've got to reduce crime. We've got to close some of the gaps on this. But when do we just complain about these issues without putting something forward? It's not enough to admire the problem.
Well, it isn't as though your opponent hasn't been elected. And oftentimes I think we in the media, it's easy to be governor and have a target on your back and find all that. That's on the front page of the Star Tribune, or Bill Warner has it with the Minnesota News Network. But it doesn't change the fact that your opponent has a record. If there was one thing that you could tell the people listening to News and Views right now about Scott Jensen that they maybe don't know, what would it be?
Yeah, I think this not having a clear moral compass on the issues. And what I say by that is he was for common sense gun reforms before he was against them. He was against, the penny a pill on our manufacturers. I'm disappointed in his overprescription of opioids and not taking responsibility for that. And I think it's this continuous complaining after the fact. I get it. I didn't make every decision right, but I stood up in front of Minnesotans and said, you know what? I'll stand up a testing regime that's better than any place in the country. I'll get you your vaccines. We'll keep your students safe. We'll do the best we can. And I think what you saw from a state senator who in the midst of all this decided to leave rather than to help us figure out how to get through it. And I think that flipping on issues, whether it's guns, whether it's on abortion, whether it's on climate change, I can't just say the things that make people happy in the room. I get it. When we were closing some of these things, there are businesses, I know they're not going to forgive me and they're not going to vote for me, but I believe it was the right thing to do. I believe we saved lives and I had to do it. And I'm not going to change just to try and convince them to get a vote. And I see this going back and forth to how you get a vote.
And I want to talk about one of those things in particular. It's a lot like, and I know it's an easy comparison, but it's a lot like the dog that caught the bus. They ran under this whole, we're your conservative, we're your family value, I'm Matt Burke, look at all the kids, that type of thing.
Yeah.
And it was all pro-life, pro-life, pro-life until they found out where Minnesota was, which was nowhere near one extreme or the other. In other words, they were where you're at.
Then hold your position.
Exactly.
If you really believed it, hold your position.
And so do you get frustrated, whether you're at a debate or whether you're anywhere, when you see something as important as what they made that in who they are, them flip-flop on it? Because to me, that's very defining.
It's cynical, and it's not like you don't learn something new, but you don't take that position for 45 years and then switch once you see something come out. And I think for me, it's frustrating that there are some core beliefs. First and foremost, this idea of jailing the Secretary of State because the 2020 election was stolen. Now, I've been very clear on this. If I don't win next Tuesday, I will concede and I will do everything possible to help them be successful. I don't need any qualification around that. I don't need to think about it. I don't need to pretend. I don't need a lawyer. And I already hear that they're saying, well, if they win, they've cheated. And Yes, that's very frustrating to me because this is about policies. My policies cut taxes for the middle class, created a surplus, created more job growth than most other states, created the lowest unemployment rate in the history of the country for any state. Those are real policies. If you don't like those, debate them. He did. He said, I want to cut the income tax. Fine. That part is legitimate. But this stuff about switching your position, about being, he looked in the eye of the camera and said, I'm running to ban abortion. That's not news. That was in May. In July, I never said I was going to ban abortion. I have been clear on this, just to keep in mind. Minnesota had one of the lowest teen pregnancy rates and the lowest abortion rates in the country because we want to give people the options to make their own health care decisions. And if that option is through either contraceptive care or through education, that's just really smart. But it's not my job to get in the middle. So this idea of not having thought about what this means in terms of women's health and the impact of it, I ran on this as a conservative southern Minnesota district, and people knew where I was at. And there is a fair debate of people who say, well, I disagree with you on that, Governor, but I never changed the position and was very clear. So, yeah, it gets frustrating that, how are you going to make these hard decisions? How are you going to make these decisions in the moment? How are you going to make life and death decisions if things that you held as core values for 40 years you are willing to flip in a minute?
Well, I think we saw that in the Supreme Court. We saw promises made, statements made, and then the opposite come true.
And it's frustrating to people.
Yeah, it's got to be really frustrating. All right, so you get the car keys again. You had them for the last 4 years.
Yeah.
Governor Walz, here they are. You got the greatest state in the union. Many believe I do. I was born there in Breckenridge. It's certainly one of the greatest states in the union. You get to run it again for 4 years. What's it going to look like at the end of those 4 years?
Yeah, well, we'll compromise on budgets. I think what we'll see is middle-class tax relief fall into that. I think we will see education start to morph into what career progressions look like, start to have more individualized attention toward them. I think you'll see some of the biggest infrastructure investments thanks to the federal government and our partnership with them. And then I will think you'll see innovation in jobs focusing around chip manufacturing, new add-on and value added in agriculture, and new opportunities, especially around clean energy. So I think what you'll see is an upper Midwest leader in moving in some of those high-tech industries, things that we have the base for, at the same time making sure that education piece is there for them.
The one thing that frustrates me as a former policymaker on a way smaller level is that we're sitting here all the time talking about the one thing that's consistent state to state, metro to urban, everything, and that is we don't have workers.
That's right.
We don't have workers. And it isn't as though Joel Heitkamp's going to go out and have any more kids.
That's right.
I mean, that's just the way it's going to be.
We're aging. This happens.
Exactly. So fix it. I mean, tell me how, should we be looking to our southern border not hating people? Should we be encouraging more legal immigration?
Legal immigration is a part of it, but I think one of the things is the mismatch in skill sets, jobs to the jobs that are available. And I think that starts working with our students when they're younger. We had a pretty successful program. We had a real problem, as everybody did, nursing home workers during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. Those are certified nursing assistants. So we went out with the state and said, okay, what's keeping us from getting those? Well, we helped them pay for their tuition. Then we helped them pay for their daycare, which were these many women of color, and we helped them pay for their transportation. Well, lo and behold, 90 days later, we have 1,500 certified nursing assistants go in there. If we would see, God forbid, another surge of COVID, we wouldn't need the National Guard to go into there because we have a workforce that's getting there. And I think starting to match that up, starting to pay the fair wages, and starting to understand what things are going to be automated and where we can use this workforce. But I think in Minnesota, we've always been welcoming. No one wants illegal immigration. The problem is there's no line to get into. So you need to create the line. You need to make sure that it's legal. You need to say if you're going to work here, you're certainly going to be verified. But let's be very honest, especially in agriculture, our immigrant community is doing a lot of that work, and it's really helping the entire economy.
Spot on. I totally agree. All right. I'm being told I got to wrap it up. So last word comes from you. A lot of times you do these interviews.
Yeah.
You leave them and you say, I wish I would have said. Well, now I wish I would have said. What are you going to tell the people of Minnesota heading into next Tuesday?
Yeah, grateful to the listeners. I've worked to try and not divide this state. I know you haven't agreed with me on every issue, but I think our results have been solid. I respect your right to go out and cast your vote, but I think an optimistic vision of Minnesota, one where we work together, one that is based on compromise, is a better vision than dividing us. So I would hope as they go into those polls on Tuesday to think about that, and we'd certainly be honored to earn their support.
So welcome back to KFGO, Governor. How you been?
Great. Thanks for having me.
You've been busy.
Yeah, I've been busy. Hope these radio waves go back across, go back east on the other side.
There are plenty of listeners over there. I assure you that. I'm getting all those messages in. So you're all doing the campaign trail. We got this final stretch. I mean, what are you hearing?
Yeah, just stopping in. Well, I think folks want to see functional government. I think in Minnesota, we're grateful. We've got lowest unemployment rate in the history of the country. We've got some job growth going on. We're seeing public safety start to stabilize a bit, especially in the metro area. And I think there's this looking forward to the future type of thing. So I think there's two very different visions of Minnesota. My opponent is convinced Minnesota's failing on all fronts. Our schools are no good. People didn't work hard enough during COVID, some of that. I disagree with that. I think we learned valuable lessons during COVID. I think we worked together. I think there's great opportunities to compromise and get things done. So I think what I'm hearing is, how about we figure out ways to work together, solve these things, move on?
Well, you talk about compromise and the struggles. I mean, Minnesota was one, if not the only one, that had a divided government
That's right.
of which you were the governor of.
That's right.
And still got some things done. Got some accomplishments. There's still some things waiting for you.
Yeah, we had another one up until May of 2022, but we passed a balanced budget. We passed the largest job bill in state history. We had a 15-year, kind of historic increase in education. We managed COVID together. We did a lot of those things, and I'm going to hold a record now. I'm going to be, I believe, as far as I know, the only governor in Minnesota history never to issue a veto, because I have to try and work with folks. And I do not view compromise as a negative. We've cut taxes for the middle class, never raised a tax, stabilized state economy. We have historic budget reserves. And through all of this, we rank as one of the 10 states with the lowest COVID deaths. And that matters.
Let's talk a little bit about COVID in this little bit of time that we've got here. I know how busy you are. On this border that we are right now, North Dakota, I mean, states all handled it very differently. And one thing that people brought up is, well, Minnesota, I can do this. North Dakota, I could do this. How do you respond to that for those businesses, those employees, the residents on this side?
Well, each state had to handle it differently. We had to go on the best evidence we had. And as I said, again, we're one of the 10 states with the lowest death rates. Mm-hmm. We also, as I said, coming out of this, have one of the fastest growing economies. We tried to manage it. I think in retrospect, one of the things that we've seen, and once we learn more about COVID, is policies that could have been more regional maybe, which we're seeing now. We're doing that with testing and treating with Paxlovid and things like that. But going back to 2020, you don't have that hindsight. You didn't have it at the time. You were making it in real time. And each state made that decision. My goal had to be, though, and I said the only metric that really mattered to me was reducing the deaths, reducing the infections, and protecting healthcare capacity while managing against the economy. And we put money in for frontline worker pay. We had, small business relief loans, things like that. So I think when you take it as a whole, and the history of this is written, Minnesota, and we have a much denser population. As you know, I was saying our Twin City metro area is the same population as North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming in one area. So we had to manage things a little differently, but I certainly believe that Minnesotans treated each other well. And again, I'll go to the end believing that reducing those death rates was the goal.
Talked about unemployment being one of the best the rates in the nation. I mean, workforce, that just shows people are working, being
That's
one.
right.
So when we talk about the economy and all these business opportunities, where do we find workers?
Yep, and we have one of the highest labor participation rates. It'd be one thing if you said, well, you're unemployed, everybody's sitting at home. They're not in Minnesota. I said I think the biggest thing is training to skills that people want to, matching up where people need to be. And we had a real successful program on certified nursing assistants in Minnesota where we went and found people who were not working, found people who wanted to get back in the market, helped them pay for childcare and transportation, trained up and certified 1,500 nursing assistants. That was a big problem during COVID. We had the National Guard doing some of these things. I think that same model, getting into high schools and working together, is the way to go to make sure that alignment is better. And again, always immigration policies. We have to have legal immigration, have to make it fair. But I think there's opportunities here to match up the folks. A lot of folks retired early. Some of them got out of the marketplace, got a little difficult. We're going to have to understand what the new economy looks like. A lot of folks working from home. I don't know. Someday you guys will broadcast from home.
Yeah, we had to do some of that actually a little bit. Yeah.
So how does that fit together? I'm looking at where the new jobs are going to be. Chip manufacturing, medical devices, ag, and food processing. Those things are critical. And I mean, Minnesota, 5th most diverse economy in the country. We don't have all our eggs in one basket. And that really makes a big difference.
You're running for re-election here. I'm curious, what's different this go-around versus that first time you ran? I mean, you're a former teacher. You've been in Congress. What's different in this setting? I mean, I can watch the national news and see that it feels different, that just the political environment is different.
Yeah,
but
midterms.
As a candidate, I'm curious.
Midterms always go back and forth on this. For me personally, it's having been the state CEO, having I don't think it's overstating it. Some of the biggest challenges that I think states have faced on this, that I think that experience, that building the team, and I think the trust that we have with, whether it's the business community, whether it's a nonprofit community, whether it's working together, I think that's there. Midterms are always this way. People sway back and forth. Let's be honest. Global inflation, war in Ukraine, those types of things take a toll on folks. And I think when people are looking, what are the plans forward? Are you going to be able to stabilize the state government? I've talked about, tax cuts for the middle class, reducing Social Security tax. I think that's what people are looking for, what the future looks like. Is there some stability coming, and how do we see beyond this? Now, GDP growth is better. I think, hopefully we'll start to see very quickly here some of that inflationary cost, but those are nation and global issues. Statewide, we've managed to be pretty solid position.
Governor, if you get reelected, I'm curious, what's that one thing that's what I need to get done in the next term here? What's that top priority?
Yeah, I think it's this issue around workforce development and education as they're tied together. I think that's the future's there, skating to where the puck's going to be. If Minnesota's can continue to be as great, we've created jobs for 12 straight months. We have some of the highest business startups. But again, if we can't find the workforce to do that, I think that combination, we're continuing to make the progress around public safety and some of the stabilization of folks to say, you know what, this is a great place to live. It has great activities. There's great jobs here. They're innovative with great schools, and it's a safe place to live. I think combining those together.
Governor, what I missed, I know you got to get on the road here. You're heading back east a little bit, but final word goes to you.
Well, just grateful to folks. I know there's been a tough few years. We haven't got everything perfectly right, but we did protect Minnesotans. I think economically we're in a solid place, and I proved that I'm bipartisan on this. I have a very different vision of the state. It's very optimistic because I think that sets with where Minnesotans are at, and just hope I can earn some support come Tuesday.
Well, I know how busy you are on this final stretch here. I appreciate you taking some time for us here on Afternoons Live.
Thanks for having me.
Very good. Governor Tim Walz.